Hi, class. I'm going to be presenting this lecture online for history of psychology, functionalism and structuralism, and cognitive psychology, simply because this week I'm going to be teaching an intensive week class, and to be teaching for 18 hours in the day probably wouldn't be a good idea for me. So hopefully this will help you out to understand this season of modern history in psychology, and particularly looking at Wundt, Hall, James, and then the school of cognitive psychology, looking at people like Piaget and Vygotsky, as well as people like Francis Galton and Alfred Binet. So just to start off a little bit with the psychology firsts, the first real school system of thinking within psychology could really be tied with what's called structuralism, and this really emerged out of Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, and emerged largely as a result of Edward Tickner's earning his degree and then bringing it to America. Within structuralism here, then, we have our first school of psychology, and it really focuses mainly upon breaking down mental processes into its fundamental components. The researchers, what they tried to do here was understand the basic elements of consciousness using what is known as introspection. The idea here with Wilhelm Wundt was to, and this really comes out of what is called phenomenology, which used introspection to understand the essence of thinking as moving towards an object of thought. And then we have Wilhelm Wundt, who was the founder of the first psychology laboratory, and he's really kind of associated with the school of thought, despite the fact that it was really his student, Edward Tickner, that coined the term that describes the school of thought. And Tickner, being an American, was describing it as something in contrast to what was going on in North America. As far as Wilhelm Wundt himself, he really worked at establishing psychology as a separate science from things like medicine or biology. And he contributed to the methods that we used in experimental psychology to think of psychology as its own distinct science. Wundt himself referred to the view of psychology as volunteerism, and his theories tended to be much more holistic than the ideas that Tickner later introduced to North America. Tickner developed the idea of structuralism to help to define the first, what we call, school of psychology, or association of thinking about psychology. But in truth, structuralism wasn't something that really caught on and really didn't survive past Tickner's death. Today, when we think of science, there are experimental methods and structures that we try to study, but it's fairly well recognized that to understand the subjective structures of the mind can be too subjective. And so the use of introspection kind of lacks a kind of reliability. And so the science of psychology today really tends to focus more on behavior rather than that is external, rather than internal behavior that's directly observable only to the individual. What structuralism is important for is simply that it was the first way of thinking about psychology as a science. And this really influences the early development of experimental psychology and being able to design good experiments. As far as Wilhelm Wundt himself, he was a professor and a scientist and established the first experimental laboratory in 1879 in the University of Leipzig, and was really interested in things like reaction times in doing his experiments. In general, German universities at this time were really expanding their resources, and so there was lots of funding for Wundt to be able to establish a laboratory, and that was groundbreaking. And he favored the scientific approach to psychology, suggesting that we look at things like chemistry and physics, but in looking at consciousness and the immediate experience of consciousness. And so there's this balance between the scientific study of a conscious experience, mental processes, memory, sensations, and things like that, and what we would consider as a pure science, like chemistry and physics. And so there is this difficult balance that went on there. Interestingly enough, Wundt was really dedicated to publishing within psychology. In fact, he wrote so much that it's the equivalent of, several dozen pages a day being published. 54,000 pages of his work were published in books and articles throughout his career. So an absolutely prodigious writing career about psychology. Wundt had real direct influence upon some early contributors of the empirical study of abnormal psychology, and a lot of his students followed his experimental methodology and applied that in their research, and that kind of defines a lot of study about clinical problems, particularly in the late 1800s. Students like Leichner-Wiltner researched combinations of clinical disorders within the University of Pennsylvania and established the first North American psychological clinic. In the very first decade of the 20th century, a lot of labs and clinics started to grow and increase in number as a direct result of this original laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. And we have Wundt's students kind of going throughout the entire world, but particularly influencing research within Germany, the US, and Canada. Overall, this approach kind of lays the foundation for formulating scientific principles about human behavior and for looking at things like dream analysis and that sort of thing, and even for the work on conditioning of Ivan Pavlov. So the question is, whether or not there would even have been the kind of psychology today without this structuralism that was in place. Another great contributor that was influenced by Wundt was a fellow by the name of Granville Stanley Hall. And he really believed that physiology and the ways that the senses function, which is very much a part of structuralist study, was essential for understanding the person. And Granville Stanley Hall did study with Wundt for a while, although he did get his PhD in psychology in North America. Granville Stanley Hall himself is a person that we need to be mindful of because he is the founder of the American Psychological Association and the founder of the first journal scientific journal of peer-reviewed scientific journal of psychology within North America. And so we have at the very beginning the American Psychological Association started out with 26 members, and now it's grown to this massive, really international enterprise with 56 different divisions within it. A few interesting things about Granville Stanley Hall. First thing is to know about him is he was a good Baptist boy, the son of a Baptist minister, and really identified with the Baptist church. That being said, he also believed strongly in evolution. And one of his descriptions of human development and psychological development was that child development was essentially a revisiting of evolution. And so when a child was born, they were like the equivalent of a little monkey. And as they grew a little bit older, then they became more like a chimpanzee. And as they grew into their early teen years, they were more like a gorilla, kind of just wild and crazy. And then they finally developed into a human being. That was kind of his thinking. And the phrase that goes along with that is what's called ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And that just basically suggests that the development and growth pattern of a human being mimics the general successive stages of evolution of remote ancestors based upon an evolutionary point of view. Another thing that he used to describe adolescence, his essential idea of adolescence was that adolescence is a time of Sturm und Drang, or storm and stress. Then we come to functionalism. And functionalism really formed as a bit of a North American reaction to structuralism and was really heavily influenced by the work of William James and by, like most academics of his time, the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin. Functionalists, and William James being a professor at Harvard, they sought to explain the mental processes in a more systematic and accurate manner. And rather than focusing on the elements of consciousness, functionalists focused on the purpose of consciousness and behavior. And so in some ways they were more holistic than a structuralist. Functionalism also emphasized individual differences, and this had a real impact on people like William James and John Dewey and Harvey Carr and John Engel. Functionalists were perhaps criticized most famously by Wilhelm Wundt, who, of course, didn't like functionalism because it was a reaction to his school of structuralism. And Wundt said, functionalism is beautiful and is wonderful literature, but it is not psychology. The reaction to this, functionalists like William James wrote something called The Principles of Psychology, and this kind of tried to describe much of everyday living and making sense of it. Functionalism also influenced the education system in North America, and especially in this regard, John Dewey's belief that children should learn at the level that they were developmentally prepared for. And so that really kind of defined a lot of public education. A little bit more about William James. He received his medical doctorate in 1869 and was teaching at Harvard beginning in 1875, and then through that time was very interested in medicine and philosophy, and melding those two together got him interested in trying to define what psychology was. Remember, psychology was just coming into its own, and he published The Principles of Psychology then in 1890, and from that point on, psychology starts to begin to be recognized more as a field within North America. One of the principles that comes from James's work is the idea that the nature of truth can be found principally in action. And this core idea is that mental states like beliefs, desires, and being in pain or whatever are constituted solely by their functional role. That is, by their causal relations to other mental states or sensory inputs and behavioral outputs. And so functionalism is a theoretical level between the physical implementation and the behavioral outcome of something. So it's that kind of mysterious midway point that is very difficult. So when we look at psychology as a science separate from things like biology and medicine and philosophy, we really see that it emerges out of the challenge and the tension between structuralism and functionalism. Structuralism emerging as the first school of thought associated with Wilhelm Wundt, and then and really structuralism and functionalism are really not all that different from each other, and this was really observed in 1906 by Mary Calkins. As she wrote in the Psychological Review, she argued that the principles of both are concerned with the conscious self. What she saw as different is that each side continues to cast its aspirations. There's plenty of school, but no thought. That's what William James wrote about structuralism, while Wundt dismissed functionalism as literature rather than science. And eventually, both of these lost out to other schools that came out of them, like behaviorism, psychoanalysis, and humanism. But at the beginning, there was this tension between these two, and that's where they existed. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about cognitive psychology and the School of Cognitive Psychology. And probably the best place to start there would be Sir Francis Galton. Sir Francis Galton was, as far as psychology goes, was very much interested in the genetics of cognition and intelligence, and really argued for hereditary genius. That's kind of his essence. But there's a lot of other things that come out from him, other ideas. He was a statistician. He was born in 1822, died in 1911. He was a mathematician, a sociologist, a psychologist, an anthropologist. Probably one of the most negative things about him is he was a eugenicist, which argued for killing off certain populations in order to improve society. He was an explorer, a geographer, an inventor, a meteorologist, and a psychometrician, meaning that he was interested in measuring psychological behavior. He wrote hundreds of papers and books, and much of what we have in statistics, particularly in the social sciences, is directly attributable to him. Things like correlation, regression toward the mean are all part of his work. One of his great interests was the inheritance of intelligence. And being a pioneer of eugenics, he actually coined that term eugenics and the phrase nature versus nurture. He's the one that kind of coined that as well. His book, Hereditary Genius, of which there are little portions within your textbook, The Mythic Mind, was the very first social scientific attempt to study intelligence, genius, and greatness. And he argues within that much of that is genetic in its origin, and that you're either born with it or not, and that you can track genius through families. As an investigator of the human mind, he was also a psychometrist, the measuring of mental faculties, and of differential psychology. And he was also very interested in fingerprints and forensic science, and he even conducted research on the power of prayer. He was interested in meteorology, and a few of his theories about perception are also interesting. Galton went beyond measurement and summary to attempt to explain the phenomenon that he was observing within perception. Among some of his developments, he proposed an early theory of ranges of sound and hearing, and he collected a large amount of data of what human beings can perceive, and noticed that there was some variability and differences between people and what they could, the range that they could see and hear things. Galton also studied human abilities, and this led to the foundation of what we call differential psychology now, and was very interested in formulating some of the earliest mental tests. He was interested in measuring humans in every way possible, and included measuring their abilities to make sensory discrimination, all the way to how that linked with their intellectual prowess. And Galton suggested that individual differences in general ability are reflected in performance on relatively simple sensory capacities and in the reaction times to these stimuli, so that variability within this could determine a person's genius, for example. And this, through his research, Galton assumed that people who reacted faster were more intelligent than others, and to some extent that was found to be false, but it got people moving in that direction anyways. Another person that died in 1911, was born a little bit later than Galton, was Alfred Binet. Alfred Binet was born in 1857 and died in 1911. He was a French psychologist who invented the very first practical intelligence test, the Binet-Simon. The French ministry had asked Binet to find a way to identify children who were slow learners so that they could give them some remedial work. And along with his collaborator Theodore Simon, Binet published revisions of his intelligence tests in 1908 and again in 1911, the last appearing right before his death. And there's quite a story about that. Binet was in the around 1880, the 1880s, he was a researcher and a director of a laboratory for experimental psychology at the Sorbonne within France. And he was promoted to director of the laboratory in 1894 until his death in 1911. Binet was educated himself to a large extent by researching anything he could find on many other researchers and other people working in clinics. For example, Jean-Martin Charcot, he worked with him for a while and studied hypnotism. Binet was also influenced by other researchers looking at the subconscious. People like Breuer and Freud were influential, as well as Carl Gustav Jung. Binet was someone that spent most of his life, though, looking at the range of skills and talents and the ways that children answered questions. And this created a normative population for him to be able to say, okay, this is normal for a 6-year-old, and this is normal for an 8-year-old. And that kind of scale created the foundation for what we call intelligence tests. So we have the Binet-Simon intelligence tests coming out in the early 1900s. Interestingly enough, that Binet-Simon test was later sold to Stanford University for guess how much money? $1. And became the Stanford Binet intelligence test, which really kind of is the standard for today for measuring intelligence. A little bit of his legacy. He was finally honored after his death in 1917. The Free Society for Psychological Study of Children celebrated his life and highlighted many of his honors. And as recently as 30 years ago, the Binet-Simon scale was recognized as one of the most significant developments or discoveries within the 20th century. So there is a lot of impact that Alfred Binet had, even though what he was primarily interested in was the thinking of children. Then we come to Jean Piaget, who Binet likely influenced very significantly. Jean Piaget was born in 1896 and lived to 1980. He was born in Switzerland. His father was a historian. And his first article was in a natural history magazine, and he was only 10 years old, where he described an albino sparrow in a park. And interestingly enough, he was offered a position based upon that article, although obviously he had to turn it down because he was only 10 years old. He got his bachelor's degree when he was 18 years old, and his doctorate by the age of 21 and he was extremely gifted in biology. He also was very interested in Binet's work with intelligence within children, and this got him looking at why children answer questions incorrectly and the kinds of common wrong answers that were present at different ages. And he came to the conclusion that older children's thinking is qualitatively different from younger children's. And so he rejected the idea that you can quantify intelligence and said that there's simply a qualitative difference, that there are certain qualitative ways of thinking that develop over time and they build upon each other. And so, and they are biologically determined. And some of these are the ideas that Piaget came up with were the ideas that people developed orderly, adaptively, qualitatively, and these were changes that came in physical, personal, social, and cognitive areas. In the physical area, there's changes to the body structure, for example, puberty. In the personal, there's changes to the personality. On the social side, that the way that people play changes. On the cognitive side, mental processes become more complex and more abstract, and hypothetical reasoning develops. And then qualitatively, all these ways of thinking are different. And so he proposed a series of stages that children would go through. They would go through the sensory motor stage, where there would be object permanence and goal-directed actions, and then there'd be the pre-operational stage where there's operations where a child can think about doing something without actually doing it, and then there's a decentering where they can distinguish between the definition of the object as either red or square. There's a reversibility, and where a child can now think backwards, for example, with counting. And there's a collective monologue where group talk can happen, but there's no real interaction that happens. Then so we have sensory motor stage, pre-operational stage, then we come to the concrete operational stage where there's some hands-on thinking, and where there's conservation of change, where there's seriation, where you can organize objects in sequential order by size or weight or volume, and this classification where you can group objects into categories. And then finally the person would come into the formal operations stage where more abstract thinking becomes possible, where the scientific, hypothetical, inductive reasoning stage of what if begins to happen. And all of these stages have significant qualitative differences that are very important for us to understand. Okay. And then we have finally Lev Vygotsky. Lev Vygotsky was born in 1896 in the Russian Empire. Today we would call it Belarus. And he was tutored privately and then went and studied at Moscow State University, where he graduated in 1917. He then attended what was called the Institute of Psychology in Moscow, where he studied and worked for 10 years. He was very much a pioneering psychologist. He wrote 6 major volumes, although he died relatively young. And he was very interested in developmental psychology, child development, and education. And his key concept that comes out of this is the ideas of psychological tools, mediation, internalization, and what we call the zone of proximal development. His work covers also the origin of the psychology of art, all the way to the development of higher mental functions and the philosophy of science and the methodology of psychological research, as well as language and thought. Essentially, the key idea with Lev Vygotsky was that social interaction is essential for solidifying knowledge, for establishing speech patterns, written language, symbolic knowledge, and knowing how to do something. The internalization of something comes largely through that social interaction, and it's a progressive process where there's a current state of development and then the zone of proximal development where a person can't quite do something without help, and having that little bit of help then moves their zone of current development forward and expands their zone of proximal development even further. And so it's a continual process of learning, thinking differently, learning new skills, learning to interact, and all of this happens best in a social environment because the interpersonal level is essential for growth.
Okay, Kristen, can you put those shapes in 4 different groups that they're all the same in one way? Kristen, can you put together shapes that are the same for me? Tell me, why did you put the circles here and these triangles here and these circles here and the triangles there?
For a pattern.
Can you get a shape that will go with a small circle? How about the small triangle? And the big triangle. Is there another shape that will go with the big circle inside? Now, can you sort the rest of those into groups that are the same?
Has Christian mastered multiple classification? The answer depends on what theory of development one ascribes to. According to the theories of Lev Vygotsky, we cannot evaluate the classifying behavior of Christian using just the level of her independent performance, or from seeing how she uses help. Knowing both is necessary for a correct evaluation. Hello, I'm Elena Badrova. I have worked in the Institute of Preschool Education in Moscow under Alexander Zaporozhets, who was a student of Lev Vygotsky, and I am currently teaching at the Metropolitan State College of Denver. Here is my colleague, Deborah Leong. She is also teaching here, and we have a pleasure of introducing you to a great theorist whose work we found very useful for developmental psychology and early childhood education. Lev Vygotsky was born about 100 years ago in 1896 in Tsarist Russia. He grew up in Gomel, a mid-sized city that is in what is now the independent nation of Belarus, about 400 miles west of Moscow. As Jews, the Vygotsky family, however prosperous, were outsiders in Russia under Tsar Nicholas. There were strict laws on what jobs Jews could hold, what regions of the country they could live in, and limits on how many could be formally educated. The odds were great, but miraculously Vygotsky gained a place. Almost immediately, he changed his major from medicine to law, graduating just as the First World War was ending and the Russian Revolution changed all institutions and expectations. Vygotsky returned to Gomel and taught. Initially, he taught literature in a secondary school, and after a few years, taught teacher education in the local training institution. Thus, he had much practical experience in the field of education. He also became interested in psychology and began doing research in this field. He moved to Moscow and entered the heady intellectual life of the pre-Stalin era of the communist experiment. It was a time of relative openness for academic freedom. During the almost frenzied last decade of his life, Vygotsky worked in a wide range of arenas. He worked with displaced refugees, with physically and mentally handicapped people, in scientific institutes and universities. He also managed to write 7 books and dozens of articles before dying at age 37 in 1934. In 1936, psychology became politicized, and only certain psychologists were approved by Stalin regime. And it was not until 1960s that the thaw in political influences on academic life occurred after the death of Stalin. Vygotsky's ideas resurfaced in Russia, and his commentaries on Piaget were published in the West. It was then that my professors became able to explore and elaborate the ideas of Vygotsky. And with Glasnost of late 1980s, Vygotsky's ideas became increasingly popular in the United States. We will use examples from 3 classrooms in this film, a Head Start and 2 multi-age primary classrooms. In Russia, I worked for 12 years in early childhood education using Vygotskyan ideas, and the last 2 years, Deborah Leong and I worked in Colorado with early childhood teachers to implement this approach.
In numerous workshops, lectures, and in our book, we have distilled the essence of Vygotsky's theory of learning and development into 4 major ideas, which we will present in this film. These form only the skeleton of his work, but understanding them will enable you to read his work and that of his associates more easily. They are: children construct knowledge. Learning can lead development. Development cannot be separated from its social context. Language plays a central role in mental development. These ideas are all interconnected and build upon each other, but in this introductory program we will discuss them one by one.
Okay, now where would you put the blue bookcase that's behind Nick? Where would you put it, Kayla?
A little, like, this far behind. Right here.
Okay.
Our first tenet is a familiar one. Vygotsky believed that children construct knowledge and do not passively reproduce what is presented to them. Learning is much more than a mirroring. It always involves the learners creating their own representations of new information. In this belief, Vygotsky is like his contemporary, Jean Piaget, who was born only 3 months before Vygotsky in Switzerland. Vygotsky studied Piaget's early work avidly, but Piaget did not read Vygotsky until very late in his much longer career. For Piaget, construction of knowledge occurs primarily in the child's interaction with physical objects.
Don't forget to fill your
For
cup
Vygotsky,
into the cup.
knowledge is not so much constructed
Do you feel it
as
all the way?
co-constructed. Learning always involves more than one human, as we shall see.
21? 31. Can you find all other legs that are here, but don't turn them over, okay? Just put all the legs close to this one. Why did you choose this one?
Because it has 4 sides like these two.
Like Piaget, Vygotsky developed his own materials to look at how children come to understand the world around them. For example, Vygotsky created this block test to study how children develop the ability to discover categories. The opposing position to constructivism is behaviorism. Behaviorists believe that there is no structural distinction between learning and development.
Once upon a time, a mouse like you was born. He went on a picnic in Washington Park. It got dark. They got lost.
Opposing this formulation, Vygotsky, like Piaget, argued that there are qualitative changes in thought, not accounted for by the accumulation of facts or skills.
It was a mother owl who lost her outlet.
Vygotsky differed from Piaget in believing that learning can lead development. Vygotsky envisioned a more complex relationship between development and learning than either the young Piaget or the elderly Pavlov had conceived. Like Piaget, Vygotsky believed that there were maturational prerequisites for certain learning. For example, you cannot master logic without having mastered language.
10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 18.
But in opposition to Piaget's early writing, Vygotsky argued that learning impacts development. With early math, for instance, learning skills can hasten development. Rather than viewing this early counting as just rote reciting, Vygotsky would argue that it nudges a child towards a concept of the symbolic nature of number. As we will see, Vygotsky gave great value to assisting children to use strategies to further their intellectual capacities.
The next time we count them, I'm going to help you.
Okay.
Put your finger out and we'll count each one.
1,
2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. But this time we're going to do it again. Miss Terry's going to help you point, but only you're going to count. I'm not going to help you count this time. I'm just going to help you point.
1, 2, 3, 4.
It is in this context that we will discuss the best-known part of Vygotsky's work, the zone of proximal development. Take, for example, the relationship between counting and the concept of number. When asked to count all these bears, a 4-year-old boy can count meaningfully to 12 and rote to 15. This is his independent performance on this task, the best he can do alone.
8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 18.
Point to each one close to the bear and count loudly.
1, 2, 3.
But when the teacher structures the activity differently, the same child can perform at a higher level, counting meaningfully to 17 without missing any bears.
15, 16, 17.
Great job, Quentin.
Put this teddy bear down so I can take a nap and count, okay?
Assistance may take the form of teacher hints or clues, or otherwise setting up a situation so a higher level of outcome can occur. This higher level, which the child is currently capable of attaining only with help, is called the level of assisted performance.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Good job, Alex.
The area between the level of independent performance and the level of assisted performance is the zone of proximal development. It is here where the teacher must focus attention. Not all the assistance used by the child needs to be intentionally provided by an adult. Vygotsky believed that a child can perform on a higher level through any type of social interaction with peers as equals, with imaginary partners, or with children at other developmental levels.
B, O, R, and there. Yeah, that was spelled right.
The zone is not static. It shifts as a child progressively attains the higher level. With each shift, the child is capable of learning more complex concepts and skills. Obviously, there are concepts and skills beyond a child's current zone of proximal development. For instance, a 4-year-old cannot be taught calculus even by the most gifted teacher. The concept of the zone of proximal development has at least 3 important implications for early childhood education.
These are called the directions. These tell you what you want to do. I want to do a car.
First, it causes us as educators to rethink how we intervene. What mediation or action on our part will help this particular child make the next step in his understanding?
Other way, Tricia.
Do we give oral hints, or do we pair him with a child who is slightly more advanced, or do we have him teach a child who is just starting?
Screw that.
Balloon from.
Second, the zone of proximal development has important implications for how we assess children. The unassisted performance level is what we have traditionally examined in both standardized testing situations and even in individual portfolios. What can a child perform alone?
It took the umbrella from Mr. With white. It took the umbrella from her.
That is Mr.
Mr. Wit.
Now what would that...
White.
Good.
These 2 children can perform very similarly unassisted. They both read the first part of the sentence easily and had trouble with the words Mr. White and quickly. However, one child needed more hints than the other, which means that they are not at the same level of assisted performance. Unassisted performance alone does not give a true picture of where a child is.
Yeah. Are you almost done? Just remember what you said that you would do for me.
And third, the zone of proximal development causes us to rethink what is developmentally appropriate. As we have traditionally conceived it, Developmentally appropriate practice is defined by the child's repertoire of fully developed skills and concepts. Teachers are apt to wait until a desired behavior emerges spontaneously before providing activities to encourage it. For example, while many early childhood classrooms have a dramatic play area, children's play often remains narrow with limited roles and stereotypical use of props. Vygotsky argued that the most effective teaching is aimed at the higher level of the child's zone of proximal development, not at the lower. Teachers, according to this stance, should provide activities that are just beyond what a child can do on her own, but within what she can do with assistance.
But I need your help. My car broke down, and I need to call. Do you have a telephone? No, we do not.
Yes, we do.
Oh, you do? Could you call for me?
Yeah,
Well, you need to call
What
my
number?
garage.
what is it?
Okay, the number is 321-4488.
With this in mind, we feel that sensitive teacher interventions can enable children to operate at a higher level of their zone and thus should be considered developmentally appropriate. The teacher can prompt the use of objects in new creative ways and model higher levels of symbolic play.
Thank you. Did you tell them where my car is? Said Croft Liebert.
Okay, we'll get it.
Some American educators who have visited the children's centers in Reggio Emilia in Italy have commented that teachers there intervene more actively than teachers on this side of the Atlantic. These interventions don't seem to block creativity, but rather give children better tools with which to express themselves. We turn now to the most pervasive of the Vygotskian tenets, that development cannot be separated from its social context. For Vygotsky, the social context influences more than just attitudes and beliefs. It has a profound influence on how we think as well as what we think. Vygotsky and his colleagues witnessed the rapid social changes in the Soviet Union that occurred when non-technical cultures, like the Uzbeks of Central Asia, suddenly were expected to participate in the quite technically advanced Western culture of the new empire. Not only was their knowledge base different, but even their way of thinking about experience was different. Vygotsky and his colleagues developed studies to examine how the social context affected the thinking, perception, and memory of the Uzbeks. Like anthropologists who have studied other pre-literate cultures, Vygotsky discovered that Western logic is not universal. Other cultures have ways of classifying and describing experience that differ from ours, but that are appropriate to their environments. These are scenes from Manus, New Guinea in the early 1950s, photographed by Lenora Forstall under the guidance of Margaret Mead. While the content and processes that we use in thinking are culturally determined, Vygotsky did believe that there is a similar structure of the mind in all humans. He believed that there are two levels of mental functioning, lower and higher. The lower mental functions consist of such abilities as reactive attention, reacting to a loud noise or bright-colored objects.
It was also the house of the seven dwarfs.
Associative memory, as when we learn to stop at red lights, and sensory motor thought. These functions are innate, part of our biological heritage, and shared with the higher animals. The higher mental processes are unique to humans, passed down through generations by teaching and learning. Their form varies from culture to culture. Through the passing of cultural tools, such functions as focused attention, the ability to concentrate in spite of distractions, deliberate memory, the ability to remember on purpose, and symbolic thought have been developed and transmitted over millions of generations. Human intellectual evolution has occurred through the passing down of these precious mental tools, which have enabled us to solve such things as abstract mathematical problems. Responding to different environmental forces, different cultures have evolved different tools. Non-literate societies use very different means of storing information than literate ones. Internal mental tools are largely language-based. For instance, mnemonic devices or categories. Young children are in the process of developing internal mental tools and require adult assistance for this process. According to Vygotsky, the whole history of human culture is based on the development of mental tools, primitive external ones to complex ones. We cannot elaborate in this program all the implications Vygotsky's theory have for cross-cultural studies, but they are many. Appreciation of the ingenuity humans have demonstrated in dealing with and transmitting their experiences is basic to understanding Vygotsky's work. Language is both the transmitter of these cultural tools and the most important of them. This brings us to our last proposition. Language plays a central role in mental development. According to Vygotsky, language is a mechanism for thinking, the most important mental tool.
Did you ever see a goose kissing a moose down by the bay, down by the bay?
Language is the means by which information is passed from one generation to another. We can see young children learning about rhymes in situations like this. We can think about and discuss things that have happened, will happen, and even things that might never happen with language.
All right, that was beautiful, you guys.
Yesterday I read these two stories to you. The true story of the Three Little Pigs by A. Wolfe, as told to John.
It is through language that all cultures have passed on the higher mental functions that enable us to make sense of our world.
Yesterday we talked about these two stories and how they were alike and how they were different. Who has an idea for today?
In the true story of the Three Little Pigs, the wolf says the true story is about a sneeze and a cup of sugar.
Okay, where would that go?
Up where it says the true story and the three.
Learning always involves external experience being transformed into internal processes through the mediation of language. Language is the medium that carries the experience into the mind. Teaching a new skill, we tell a child what it is we want him to do. Children appropriate the rule and use it independently to regulate their own behavior. Thus, all learning goes through this cycle of exterior and interior prompts, eventually becoming a part of the children's own repertoires.
Now the circles and the colors help us see how these stories are alike and different. At the top, in red, we see ideas that are just about the true story of the Three Little Pigs. For example, the cover is like a newspaper, and the wolf wasn't really bad, he just wanted sugar. In the middle part in purple, these are how the stories are alike. They both have three little pigs and a big bad wolf, and they are both fairy tales. At the bottom in blue, these are ideas just about the Three Little Pigs. It was the pig's version, and the wolf doesn't have a house.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Vygotsky's work reminds us of the processes necessary for children to regulate their own internal and external behavior. Encouraging children to draw what they are experiencing, to talk to each other about it, to write about it, and even to talk to themselves about it, enables them to move towards being independent learners. The aim of Vygotsky's educational practices was to develop an independent, self-regulating individual who could work with others to use the lessons of the past to push the envelope of the present. Understanding the zone of proximal development expands the ways teachers can guide and influence a child's active learning. Vygotsky's analysis of learning can enable children to master their own behavior and to foster what Vygotsky called rousing minds to life.
Isn't it exciting to think that a Russian thinker who was born in the 19th century can enrich intellectual lives of children who will spend the majority of their lives in the 21st century, and the country can never visit it?